to start this video by moaning about what a miserable day it was to be a pond man. But the weather's broken, there's blue in the sky, and there's a bit of sunshine, although I'm sure it's not going to last. Now, for all of my viewers who are not based in the UK and not accustomed to our ways, us Brits are pretty obsessed with the weather. Me particularly, as I'm working outside all the time, and I do like to start most conversations off with some weather-related comment, so please excuse me. Now, if you're not familiar with the channel, I'm Ed from Crystal Clear Aquatics. Welcome, and today is another Ponds Revisited. Now, this is a pond that Dave and I restored early last year, spring of 2022, so it's had just a little over a year now to fully establish, and it's always really nice to come back and to see how the plants around a pond are settling in. When you're doing a job like this is quite a big pond on this kind of scale. It's quite an invasive procedure, and it can make quite a mess around a pond, so it takes a little bit of time for the ground to recover. But it's always amazing how quickly it does recover and how quickly the plants do grow back. And here comes the rain, by the way. Now, you may notice that the water clarity is not quite as clear as many of the ponds that I build and work in, and that's because this pond is a natural pond. There's no filtration system maintaining clear water, and we're relying solely on the plants here to create a nice natural environment. As a result, clarity will suffer. Now, I'd like to think that this time next year, once the pond has had a further season to establish and the plants have really matured, that the clarity will improve. But I have to say it's not bad as it is. There's fish in the pond. I can see them shoaling around. I've seen a couple of groups of some small babies as well, where they've obviously spawned this year. So that's a really good, encouraging sign. There is obviously moving water with a pump and this cascade here, and that's helping to boost oxygen levels in the water. Having aerated water always improves water quality and will help clarity in the long run as well. Now, I'm just coming here today to do a little bit of a service on the pond, mostly plant management at this time of year. We're in July, midsummer, although again, you really wouldn't know. So it's all about deadheading plants, removing some of the dead leaves, removing blanket weed and algae. So I'm just coming here today to do a little bit of a tidy and administer a few important treatments to the pond. But more than anything, it was a nice excuse just to come back and to see how it's settling down. I remember building this pond very well, particularly a lot of these rocks, which are on the rather large side. This one in particular, I think this is probably, and still is, one of the biggest rocks that Dave and I have had to manhandle into position. But I'm pleased we took the effort because it does look nice sitting there. It's lovely when you're doing a job and you've got lots and lots of natural materials already in use that you can reclaim. Having stone that's already weathered and worn and discoloured like this with mosses and lichens is a real bonus, and it helps to make a cascade like this look so much more natural as soon as it's been built. Having a few little plants like this mind your own business here, or angel's tears, helping to soften the stonework, really helps to create the effect of an aged feature, an aged cascade. One of my favourite plants, that one. Takes really nicely. I love these little areas here of cascades where the water just drips and finds its own way back into the pond. Bit of blanket weed, that's inevitable, particularly in a cascade in shallow flowing water like this. Blanket weed always tends to grow first in moving, well aerated water. I'll give this a bit of a clean today. A couple of weeds like this willow herb here which needs to be removed. But great to see how everything's taken. All the ferns that have been put back in have survived. I love ferns around ponds. The geraniums, the begonias. It's loving the mist, look, that's lovely. This is a great plant to have beside a pond, the begonia. Evergreen, always providing a bit of colour all year round. As it establishes and grows, it will flop over into the pond like this and send down some roots into the water, helping to give it a bit of a drink. But this is a fantastic plant to have around the edges of ponds, as you can imagine. The shade and the cover provided in this is fantastic for pond wildlife. Goldfish are doing well and have survived the heron. And the water lilies, despite it being a miserable summer, have thrown up lots of flowers and are doing pretty well. This bed of yellow iris I put in has really established and filled out nicely. Lots and lots of flowers, as you can see from these old flower stems that I'll cut away. A little bit of duckweed growing in there. Well, it's nothing to worry about, and as a natural pond, not to be discouraged, but certainly to be controlled. You may also see this little plant down here. Now, despite it being quite an attractive little thing, this is actually an invasive pest. It's not something that we're allowed to sell in the UK anymore, and it was here originally in the pond, and it's here to stay. This is something called, well, Tilia recurva, often in the trade. New Zealand pygmy weed is probably its more common name, and it's a little delicate-looking succulent that can grow both in or out of water, fully submersed as an oxygenating plant, and it will grow as this sort of dense cushion above water level as well. It's attractive. It's got these nice little white flowers, very dainty flowers, but the problem is it's incredibly invasive, and it will form this incredibly dense, thick mat of foliage, blocking out light and stopping anything else from growing. A bit like the mind your own business, it is a good plant to soften edges though. Geraniums are another fantastic pondside plant to have. Again, I love plants that tend to kind of flop, look a little bit more natural, provide lots of cover, and just soften and blur the edges. Now, I'll put a link in the description below this video in the header bar, details of the original build if you're interested in watching. It was essentially a basic reline job. I managed to sort of talk my clients into spending a little bit more money so we could do a few tweaks to this. So in the process, we made it a little bit deeper, we altered the shape a little bit, adding this lovely seating area, this patio beside the pond, which I think this area has always cried out for something like this. Redesigning and redoing the cascade. It was originally kind of just a rock and overhanging spill with water pouring over it, so it was nice to be able to do something a little bit more exciting with that. And I'm really pleased with the results. This is one of my favourite, albeit small, one of my favourite cascades. I love the stonework on this, and I love now that the plants have really established and kind of closed in to soften the edges. It looks so much more natural. The stonework for this job was predominantly done with aquatic expanding foam. This area of stone here, which became the foundation for the paving, that was mortared into place, but the rest of the stonework, all of the large bits and pieces, and the cascade was all built out of a Waza foam fix or rock fix, which is an expanding foam that helps to expand, encapsulate the stonework and just hold it into place. And it's a very quick, convenient way, an efficient way of fixing stonework around the edges of ponds. It's a great material to use, and if you've not used it before or not familiar with it, check out the video of the build so you can see me using it in action. Now, at this time of year, July, ponds need a little bit of TLC. If you've got a lot of lilies in the pond, then it's worth going around removing some of the dead and yellowing leaves, and more importantly, deadheading the used flower buds. It's very obvious when a lily flower needs to be picked off. Its head will have drooped and it'll sink into the water, and if it's really old, it'll be sort of fully submersed in the pond, and you can just lightly pull it away. Now, there's a couple of reasons why you want to deadhead water lilies. One is that it encourages additional flowering for the rest of the year. With water lily flowers looking so beautiful, who wouldn't want to encourage more flowers? But two, and perhaps more importantly, if you've got a lot of water lily in your pond and you've had a very prolific year of flowers, these very fleshy kind of buds will then start to decompose in the pond, and they can produce, towards the end of the season, September, October time, an oil slick on the surface of the pond. So you want to try and remove these and the decaying leaves of the lily as frequently as possible. The same is true of a lot of flowering marginals. Irises, as lovely as they are over far too quickly in ponds. They've got a very, very small flowering window, and then for the rest of the year, they can look pretty untidy, to be honest. You can do a few things to help that out and to make them still look a little bit more attractive, and one of the main ones is to make sure that you cut away these flower stems. Now, this is looking remarkably tidy. I think it's in quite a sheltered position here. Probably the wind hasn't got to these, but what will often happen, and I saw it on a pond I was working at yesterday, these become so top heavy that they weigh down all of the foliage around the plant. It just looks awful, at which point you then have to cut most of the leaf away. So with these flower stems, just cut them away as close to the base of the plant as possible. If you want to try and let the plant self-seed, you could leave one in position, but irises tend to grow quite rampantly via their sort of creeping rhizomes in any case, so I wouldn't be too concerned about trying to get these to seed. There's some real weight to these flower stems. Those seed pods are very heavy. Iris seed pods are quite pretty in themselves if you do leave them on the plant and let them dry. The seed pod will naturally start to crack open, and inside you've got beautiful neat lines of very, very well fitted seeds. Let's see if we can open one up and show you inside. Looks a little bit like corn in the cob, sweet corn or maize. There we go. So you see these lovely, lovely, neat lines of seeds here. And once this is dried, you could propagate from this and you could sow some seeds yourself. With the irises, just to make them look a little bit tidier, if you've got any leaves that have snapped or bent and broken away, any dead or brown fronds, just trim all of those away. And it can give the otherwise tired looking iris a new lease of life. I have to say, I'm quite impressed actually with water clarity. Although I've been in the pond and I've stirred it up a little bit, bringing some of this muck into suspension, you know, I can see halfway down, green water isn't an issue. Blanket weed, minimal. So that's actually very encouraging for a pond which is still really in its infancy. It takes a couple of years for a pond to really settle down and establish, and during that time you can often get many more problems with green water and blanket weed. So that's really encouraging signs. I think that's been helped by having quite a lot of this weed here. This is an oxygenating plant called hornwort. There's a few plants that you can have in the trade below water level that we would call an oxygenating weed. Quite often the misconception is that they're sold as a plant that will help to aerate the water. And although oxygenating plants will oxygenate the water during the day as they photosynthesize, plants at night time will respire and start to use up oxygen. So you're not buying these plants to aerate water. Instead, you're buying plants like this to be able to use up nutrients, to mop up free nutrients in the pond, which is going to encourage algae and blanket weed, green water, etc. In a static pond, a pond without filtration, you want to aim for about 2/3 of a pond full of a different mixture of plants. 2/3 of the surface covered to help break sunlight, prevent light getting down into the water column, which is going to encourage algae. 2/3 underwater, full of pondweed like this to help use up nutrients and to starve the algae. And then a combination of marginal plants around the edges, which again, aesthetically are attractive. The root structure often helps to bind away some of the nutrients as it grows, and it's a great transition for wildlife to get in and out of the pond. But pondweed like this is really important if you haven't got filtration. Now, if you have got filtration, planting, as long as you've got the correct filtration, is purely cosmetic. But of course, from a wildlife perspective, it's always nice to have an addition of plants. Biodiversity is only going to encourage different wildlife from visiting your pond. But be careful if you've got pumps in the pond and you've got weed like this, very quickly this weed is going to cover the pump and block it up. Now, it's not doing too much of an issue on this pump. The pump hasn't had a clean. I'll have a look at it today and take it out of the pond and see if there's any muck around it. But at some stage when this stuff really starts to take hold, and it will need to be thinned out in the future, trying to keep an area clear where the pump can sit away from this is always beneficial. Now, this hornwort, I think, is more desirable than the other popular pond plant, Alodia crispa, or Canadian pondweed. Alodia crispa is a very dark, sort of dense whirl of foliage, but I think it tends to look a little bit scrappy. Alodia likes to have a thick bed of silt in the bottom of a pond into which it sends down these anchor roots. And most ponds, particularly fish ponds, we're trying to discourage settlement of alluvium, of silt on the bottom of the pond. So actually Alodia doesn't grow very easily in a pond. But the hornwort is a non-rooting plant, and this will grow quite happily in a pond. In the winter it sinks to the bottom, in the summer it comes up to the surface, and it just sort of floats around in the water column close to the surface. A very low demanding and easy weed to have in a pond. Now, a lot of people often come to me and say that they think weeds such as Elodea or hornwort will actually encourage blanket weed and algae to grow in the pond. And this isn't true. All plants are going to help to compete with algae by using up nutrients. The more plants you've got in the pond, the less chance algae has got to grow. But what can happen is the Elodea crispa or the hornwort, as it grows vigorously in the summer, will form rafts of foliage at the surface, and the blanket weed can then use this as a platform on which to grow, so that it's growing closer to the surface and it gets maximum light. You can try and carefully pick away some of the blanket weed off of the algae. It's not easy to do so, and often you end up having to either throw away some of that weed, or better is to treat the pond with an anti-blanket weed treatment. And that's something that I'll be doing today. Although there's minimal blanket weed in here, I always like to treat a pond with blanket weed treatments just to help prevent blanket weed from forming and to use it as a preventative measure. Oh, as I've been trimming away some of the lilies, I discovered this lovely chap. Look at the size of him. This is the great pond snail, Limnia stagnalis snail. Great big foot on that thing. Now, snails, like the great pond snail, get a bad rap in a pond, often considered a pest or a pest snail. I wouldn't be too concerned if you've got them in your pond, as long as you've only got low numbers. All snails are going to help eating decaying foliage in a pond, and that's only a beneficial thing. The problem can arise if you've got an abundance of food source and the snails overpopulate. They don't look particularly attractive when you see lots and lots of them around the pond. But if you've got a small pond, a small volume of water, and you get lots of these chaps dying and decaying in the pond, that can cause havoc with water quality issues, as they're quite a large, meaty, fleshy thing to decompose in a pond. But that's not the snail's fault. That's the fault of the pond or the pond owner. And it's more important to try and get the root of the source, which is the abundance of food in the first place. And that's why it's very important to trim back plants at certain times of the year, and to make sure you're reducing the organic decomposition in the pond, in turn preventing too much of this kind of thing from overpopulating. Another story I often hear about these chaps are that they will eat new shoots of water lilies. Again, that's not something that I've ever actively discovered. The main issue with water lilies, I find, is the lily leaf beetle and aphids, green fly, black fly, that kind of thing. I can never say that I've seen damage as a result of snails. What you will find is often underneath the leaf of a water lily, I have been going around looking on these, and typically I haven't found any, but you'll see lots and lots of eggs from the snails. Now, the great pond snail is very, very obvious. You have these long, sort of worm-like, clear, gelatinous blobs, and that's the eggs of the snails. Back you go. Now, I'm almost finished with this service, but one last job that I like to do with all pond servicing is to administer some pond treatments. A very useful one is cloverleaf blanket answer. This is something that I recommend regularly. It's been the UK's most popular algae treatment for many years, for good reason. I'm not sponsored by or affiliated by any products that I use, but this is definitely something that I have full faith in working. Generally 2 to 3 applications a year of blanket answer will get rid of and prevent blanket weed growths. Spring, summer, kind of autumn, winter, those are the times of the year that I would recommend using it. It's a powder. Mix it up in a bucket of pond water, evenly distribute it around the pond. It will cloud the pond up and make it very milky for a couple of days. That'll settle in clear, and it's completely harmless, but a fantastic treatment. Now, that's it for today's service and Pond Revisited. Thank you for watching. If you enjoy any kind of pond related content and you get anything out of my videos, then please consider liking and subscribing. It does really help the channel. I'd also like to say a massive thank you to, once again, Tony Piscatelli and Derek Barker. Thank you very much for your donations via the thanks button, which you'll see at the bottom header of these videos. Really, really appreciate your donations. Very, very kind of you. Thank you. Well, that's it for now. As ever, thank you very much for watching. I'm Ed from Crystal Clear Aquatics. I'll see you in the next pond. Cheers.